Welcome, everyone. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about dealing with noise and outliers. Look at the schedule. We have 2 sections left in the course. Things, kind of topics we haven't covered yet. We'll do a 1 week on kind of dealing with noise, and then about 2 weeks in dealing with graphs. We've touched on both of these topics earlier in the semester. I guess we did spectral clustering with graphs, and with noise, kind of the anomaly detection lecture is going to be related and relevant here. So the 2 topiks on dealing with noise, we're going to kind of be looking at, you can kind of think of them in 2 ways, in certain perspective. With the first lecture today, we're going to think of with these outliers, and this is basically dealing with noise that we don't want in the data. Then the next lecture will be on privacy, and one of the lessons that we'll take away from that lecture is when you want to add noise into your data. If you do it in kind of various clever ways, you can make certain guarantees about privacy. Both the lectures will be broader than just those views. Okay, so let's get into it. So we're talking about noise and outliers, and so when we have data, there are different types of noise that we want to think of. So and so depending on the type of the noise, we want to kind of handle it in different ways. So the first type is measurement noise. So this is if you're trying to, so often you think of for all, so if I have data X, which is equal to X1 plus X, up to Xn, you often think of each Xi as equal some kind of true Xi, some actual value that it represents, plus some epsilon I, and you'll say that the epsilon I is usually drawn from some noise model, and so some noise distribution. In the lecture last week, Wednesday, I kind of went into some recent work on linear distance metric learning, and we talked about how if you assumed a specific noise model, then you could kind of recover this exactly. So often this noise is I'm reading some data, but when I'm reading it, the sensor is not totally accurate, or I'm trying to embed the data in some learned representation, but maybe I don't have enough kind of data to train it on, so the representation I've learned is not perfect. There's usually some noise. The most common noise is the normal distribution. So the normal distribution would be unbiased. This sort of noise, we often assume that's going to be unbiased. If there's a bias, there's almost kind of nothing we can do with it in this respect. But what's happening is you read a data point not at its true location, but at some true location plus some noise in so some amount. And so usually we deal with this by designing a loss function or some optimization function criteria. So remember, if you have normal noise, this normal noise is something like e to the power negative x minus 0 squared, and in the case of just identity covariance, divided by 2. So this kind of, it's this kind of normally this bell-shaped curve. And if we want to kind of model the probability of seeing something, we often look at the log of this term because we have a bunch of independent samples. You take the log of a product of independent samples, you get a sum. And ultimately, the loss function here, the loss function also often, if it's normal noise, turns into the sum of the squared errors, right? So you have an estimate of the true mean or the true value minus these xi squared. Okay, so often if you have normal noise, you say, well, I want to minimize the sum of the squared errors. Or if it's some other sort of noise, like logistic noise, maybe it's like logistic loss, or other ways you can do this depending on how you model the noise. All right, so this sort of measurement noise often turns into what you optimize over. Okay, it's not really problematic. It's just kind of, okay, we don't get the exact values, but if we get enough data and we model this data properly, then we can still kind of work with it fine. Okay, so another type of noise would be spurious readings. Okay, and so these are often what we think of as like outliers. Okay, so you could think of having a bunch of data that is in here, and it's from some value with noise, and then you have one data point that's out here. This would be an outlier. And so it's very far from what you would expect, even if there was a noise model, right? So some normal noise model, it'd be very unlikely to find a point all the way out here, for instance. Okay, it doesn't need to be this far away. You could have a spurious reading, which is somewhere in the mix. But like these are readings where like you have a sensor that's collecting data. For instance, I'm working with some astronomy data right now, and they're pointing these big telescopes up at the stars. And sometimes if it's raining out, there are certain signals that they're reading are kind of interfered with by the rain, right? Or if there's one of these these satellites that are floating above, if that is in the right kind of range of view, it completely interferes with the signal, right? So you get this signal, which is basically is not useful in predicting your model. And in fact, if you try and fit your model with this data point, it might cause some problems. Sometimes this corresponds with something interesting happening, right? So these are all the the readings here. Let's say there's a bunch of like so ducks, right? And so this would be like a swan, right? So there's a litter of baby ducks. There's one that looks very different. It's this one out here. It's interesting, and you want to identify that it's interesting to study this further. It may not be a misreading, but it's somehow not what you intended from your data set. So identifying these might be interesting, but not with respect to trying to understand the red distribution, which is your model of the data. Okay, and then, so we'll mostly be focusing on dealing with these spurious reading, these outlier sort of noise today. So as I mentioned, there's kind of another sort of noise which can that can kind of be um, be be also associated. There can be some background data, right? So let's say I want to kind of understand what prerequisites undergraduates should take before taking this course, right? So I'm polling people who are in this course, but not everyone in here is an undergraduate. Roughly a third of you are in like in a graduate program or above. And so for those sort of people, if I ask them about the data, they're not from the data set I'm so hoping to understand. So I kind of want, for the purpose I want to understand, I don't want to include this data, right? So you could think of having kind of a spatial picture might be that there is kind of a bunch of data in the plane, and I want to understand the mean of this data, but there's some sort of kind of region where the data is drawn from, and there's also some uniform data in the background. So if I zoom in here, there's sometimes I could draw a circle around here and say, well, stuff outside this circle is probably not relevant. Maybe this is a useful thing to do, but there's some of the blue data that's going to fall in here as well. And so I kind of want to filter this out, right? If I can model the blue data, the background data, as kind of uniform over a region, well, then I can actually subtract some percentage of the data inside the circle because I expect there to be blue kind of uniform data at the back. Okay, so there are various ways that this kind of shows up as kind of a third type of noise. It's not necessarily like a spurious reading because it's something very kind of rare from the data set, and it's not the standard noise from sensing it, but it's because there's data other than what I'm trying to sense that's kind of mixed in with what I'm trying to sense and understand. Okay, so these are kind of there are ways from like the anomaly detection framework we talked about earlier in the semester that can deal with this sort of approach. If you want to kind of ask me about it kind of after class. All right, so let's look at this outlier sort of data. Okay, so what can we do about outliers? Okay, so dealing with outliers. So there are two things to keep in mind when we want to deal with outliers, and we may want to use different strategies depending on which one of these which one of these goals we have. The first one is to estimate a model of the like the inliers. The inliers is all the data which is not the outliers. Okay, so of all the data which are not the outliers, I want to estimate some model, and the outliers are kind of getting in the way of this sort of estimate. Okay, the other thing is just to identify outliers, since these may be interesting. So they may be interesting, but they're only interesting if they really deviate from what I would expect. Okay, and these are the methods we'll talk about will kind of both sort of approach these, but depending on what you want to do, you may be solving better for solving one than the other. So to estimate the model, I don't necessarily need to remove all the outliers. So I just need to estimate the model well. If I have a good estimate of the model, it turns out it's easier to identify outliers. If I want to identify the interesting outliers, well, that may not be all of the outliers. Some of the outliers are things that are strange, but they don't, for the readings I have. So for instance, if I have a bunch of like baby ducks and there's like a swan mixed in with them, right? At some stage, the swan looks close enough to the ducks that it acts like a duck, it quacks like a duck, maybe it's fine. I don't need to filter it out. It's not interesting yet at that stage, right? So it's not doing anything different. So I don't necessarily need to identify it. So yeah. So okay. So hopefully we'll understand kind of why these are not exactly the same goal, but they're kind of related. If I could remove all the non-trivial outliers, maybe I can estimate the model. But as we'll see, this is not entirely true. Sometimes even identifying all the outliers which can individually significantly affect the model doesn't mean there's not a group of them that together can affect the model and so okay. So there's the way we're going to think about finding outliers requires, okay, this requires a kind of an assumption that the data is fit by some model M of, let's say M from some family of models. Okay, so this is a family of models. Okay, and there's some model which describes the inlier data, right? So specifically, this describes the inlier data. Inlier data is described by some model. Okay, what is a family of models? Okay, so if I have a family of models, and this is my script M, okay, so examples, and so the one example we'll describe most of in this lecture, go most in depth, and is a great kind of point to look at, is if we think that our data X is drawn from a normal distribution with mean mu, which we don't know, and the covariance is the identity covariance. And so this is going to be we're going to eventually talk about this in D dimensions, right? So this will be X subset of RD. Okay, so this would be one example of a model. Okay, but there could be other examples, okay, where it's going to be we can describe the data X from a k-means clustering, or even better, kind of a mix of Gaussians, which is a more generative model. Okay, we could assume that it's a low rank plus normal noise, right? So this would lead us to wanting to do PCA, for instance. So PCA would fit that. There's some low rank subspace the data lies on, but there's normal noise off of this. Then PCA is exactly the right model. It could be something from supervised learning, like linear regression, right? Where there's some functional data where some data predicts another value, but that value has, again, normal noise on it, is the least squares approximation. It could be nonlinear regression, right? It could be kind of a mixture of these things. Okay, so we have some sort of model that we think the data is coming from. Okay, and you could think of other things in this space as well. We could think, okay, the data is somehow a graph, and we have the nodes, and the edges are the data, and that's so the edge weights, whether it exists or not, is something we would like to predict. Right? There are a variety of ways of thinking about what is the model here, but all of these you can often reduce to something like data is drawn from the mean, and you get a fairly similar problem. It could be that's drawn from a mean, we don't know the mean, and we don't know the covariance of the structure. Again, you can kind of reduce it back to this problem. There may be better ways of doing it, but often this is kind of a problem which you can use to solve all this. You put all your parameters that you need to estimate as the mean, and you assume there's normal noise off that, and up to some tricks, this is kind of a useful kind of thing to think about. Yeah. So okay. So in order to deal with outliers, if we don't know, have a good guess of what the model should be of the data, right? Right. Then it's hard to say whether a data point is an outlier or not, right? It could be, well, that's the usual sort of the data. We just, there's a clump of data over here and some other kind of occasional data out there. Maybe that's what we think the data should be, and the outliers are not necessarily kind of problematic. There's another way of thinking about this we will get back to later in the lecture, where there's these density-based outlier detections. This assumes a parametric model where we can reduce the model to estimating some parameters. Okay. Okay, you can kind of deal with this with a non-parametric model, but it's a little bit harder to kind of justify what it means to be an outlier from a distribution. If you have an assumption and a reason to believe there's some parametric model, there's some structure to it that you think should exist for some reason based on your domain knowledge, and you can describe that shape with some small number of parameters, then this will make sense. Okay. So we have to assume that there's some family of models that we think fits the data. Okay, once we have this, then so then there's a fairly kind of one main paradigm of how to remove the outliers. Okay. First, fit the best model, M star equals the arg max of M in this, of the family of models we assume, of the likelihood of M given the data X. Okay, so we somehow say, what's the maximum likelihood model? Okay, often this looks something like minimize the sum of the squared errors. And we work with often the sum of the squared errors because it corresponds with the negative log likelihood of normal noise, and because we can often solve for this explicitly. Right? For instance, if we assume it's normal noise in d dimensions, we can take the sample mean of the data. That tells us what the parameters of the model. Okay, so we can, and that corresponds with the negative log of the likelihood, and we want to minimize that. That's maximizing the likelihood. Okay, so we somehow want to find the best fit model to the data we have. Okay. Okay, then for all X in the data set, or Xi, calculate the residual Ri, which is somehow going to be think of it as a distance from Xi to the model Okay, and so how far is it from the model? Okay, so what does this distance mean? It can take a variety of forms. Okay, one way of thinking about this, a common way, is that if we have some m of xi equals, say, if this was k-means clustering, right? Then this would be, I have a set of these cluster centers of xi, and so this B maps onto the closest cluster center. So this is the closest cluster center, and then D of xi m of xi is just going to be the distance from xi to phi of s of xi. All right, so this would be for k-means cluster. Okay, so if I'm fitting one mean, it's just the distance to the actual mean. Okay, the one mean the actual mean that I have. Okay, and I calculate a residual. Okay, if this is regression, the residual is the distance and the prediction of the y value of the data point. Right, and so you can think of computing this residual in some way. And again, we've talked about a wide variety of distances in this class. You plug in the one that makes the most sense for your model. You can think of this in cases where I can actually write down the likelihood function as actually the distance would be kind of, maybe it's the negative log likelihood of that point. Okay, that would be a way of doing it where larger values are less well fit. Okay, if I just the likelihood of the data point, then I get a small value if it's not very well fit by the model. Okay, but the residual, usually if it's large, that means it's not well fit. So it could be the negative log likelihood, or the negative log likelihood of mxi. Okay. So again, for the case of a mean, that would be the squared distance. Squared distance or the square root of the squared distance, either one will work. Okay, and then the third step is remove the xi in x such that the ri is too big. All right, so if the residual is very far from the model I fit, that means it's not fit very well by the model. I should remove this. I should remove this data point. Okay, so it seems, I hope this seems like a very sort of obvious thing to do if you understand what the model is, that this is a fairly obvious kind of approach and paradigm. Okay, maybe it was too obvious to write down, but I thought it was important to write this down. Okay, so when does this work? When does this not work? Okay, is this always going to work? What could go wrong? Yep.
Because how do we define a large residual?
Oh, okay, yeah. So we have to decide, what does it mean to be too big, right? So how do we define what's too big? We have to have some threshold here. Yeah, basically every outlier, so a removal method, there may be some exceptions in the literature, and you can look into what those mean, but they're almost always going to have a threshold. Okay, so this basically needs like some sort of threshold for what you feel is too big. If your model has built into it, if your model is that it's normal noise with identity covariance, then you kind of have a built-in scale parameter where you believe that the scale distance from the mean should be roughly 1 in any one of the coordinates, right? And that's kind of a reasonable amount of error. Anything too far from that is far. But again, okay, how many standard deviations away from what I would expect do you think is too far? It would be 2 standard deviations. 2 standard deviations should capture about 95% of the data. So even if I generate data from a normal distribution, 5% roughly is outside of 2 standard deviations. Okay, let's do 3 standard deviations. Okay, now about 1% or 0.5% of the data is outside of 3 standard deviations. All right, so this corresponds with roughly a p-value of 0.05 or 0.01. Sometimes real data, generated from this noise model will fall outside those. Are those outliers or are they not outliers? All right, so I know some people advocate 5 standard deviations is quite safe. It's quite unusual for something to be outside of 5 standard deviations. Be roughly, yeah, so a bit, roughly 1 in, I don't have it in front of me, between 100,000 and 1 million. Kind of, if you're outside 5 standard deviations, that's quite rare. If you accidentally identify those as outliers, maybe that's not a big deal, right? Maybe that's what we should strive for. But maybe there are other ones that are causing problems that are not that far outside of the distribution, right? So what is the right threshold here? Okay, so this is something we need to deal with, and there may not totally be a good answer. I will give you, and so it's kind of a user-defined parameter for the most part. Sometimes there's a good answer, but often this is user defined, and so it may depend on the situation. Is it okay to be aggressive in pruning outliers, or do you only want things that are you quite confident are quite far away? You don't want to throw away data that you think is probably reasonable, right? How is this affecting the actual analysis? Okay, so this is definitely something you need to think about and deal with. And there's not kind of a magic wand or an answer from like an algorithms textbook. Oh, here's how you solve this optimally, right? You just kind of have to look at your situation and decide what fits well for that situation. All right, but this is kind of a necessary aspect of it. It's not necessarily a problem where this can fail, right? Where could this fail? Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's how do we decide which distance?
Yeah. So again, you have this, you had one modeling choice down here, right? You need some threshold to define this. You have another kind of modeling choice, which is the distance you use. And there was also kind of this other one, which we talked about on the previous slide, which is the family of models that you chose, right? In order to do this sort of approach effectively, you really need to do a fair amount of modeling of the problem. Okay, it's not necessarily problematic or where this fails. This is just kind of the nature of the beast here, right? I could, again, if I have a likelihood well defined, I can use the negative log likelihood as the distance. Okay, but this isn't kind of a failure of this general approach. So what if my goal was to estimate the parameters of the model? I said, this is my goal. Right, my goal is to estimate M star. This to give me a good M star, the model which is representing my data. I found the low rank subspace. I found my K clusters. I found the mean of my distribution, which is kind of useful in a bunch of things. Well, according to this, I solved that goal in the first step. Why did I have to do steps 2 and 3? So why do I have to do steps 2 and 3 if my goal may have been finding M star? Yeah, so the M star here is calculated with the outliers in the data set X, right? Right. So what can go wrong, right? So let's say a mean of X in R1. And so I have each, so, this is X1, X2, and you have some nice distribution here, and you have one outlier out here. Okay, and so I want, this is the true mean. Okay, and if I run this, this is going to be the sample mean here. This is or mu star, and okay, so then if I do this, then I estimate the mean as the blue point, and this is M stars in the model of the normal noise using that as the mean. Okay, and if you notice all of my good data, these are the inliers. Well, the mean is outside kind of this convex hull of the inliers, right? One data point, one outlier can pull this distribution off. Okay, so this maybe would have worked. I found this M star distribution. I got my mu hat, and I said, what's the furthest away point? The furthest point, this residual, let's say this is xj, for rj is very large, so I can identify as an outlier. Okay, so now, but the problem was my goal, but this was my goal. So how well did I do with my goal? I didn't solve my goal here, right? So what should I do? Yep.
Do you repeat step 1 and try to find the best model again?
Yeah.
Noise removed.
Great. So now repeat after filtering outliers. Okay, now I'm going to have copy this. Nope. Okay, oh, it's up here, but it's gone. I almost succeeded in doing that. Okay. Oh. Okay, now, so let's call x1 equals x set minus the outliers. And so this would just be the inliers. And now I'm going to estimate u hat 1. This goes into m star 1. And this will be the normal distribution u hat 1 with the identity covariance, or just a variance of 1 here. Right, so now just on the inliers, I can recalculate this, and then I get a better estimation of the model. Okay, so in general, so go to 1 on x set minus the outliers. Okay, and if I decide that there are no residuals which are too big, then I don't have to repeat, right? Then I can stop. Okay, so this this paradigm generally works pretty well. Okay. This generally works pretty well. It could be this could still go wrong. And if we look back at this picture, it doesn't always solve it. I could decide, like, it could be that this point might think that this distance is too big. Right? So is this distance to the first point on the left now too big because the mean got pulled too far to the right? In an extreme case, maybe it got pulled so far to the right, you had set some automatic threshold based on the kind of the covariance structure. I said 5 standard deviations. Outside 5 standard deviations, I'm going to remove all the points. Maybe that sample mean got pulled 5 standard deviations away from the closest point among the inliers, and I throw all the data away in step 3. Okay, so you kind of have to be careful in this in the pruning of the outlier step, in that you want to make sure you don't like accidentally throw away all of your data. If your initial estimate is not a good enough estimate, then it's not going to be necessarily very good, helpful for pruning outliers either. Okay, so this might not work. So might not work if the M star is 2 for an kind of estimate of of the true model, right? So if my initial guess M star or my mu hat is too far off from what the true model is, I may prune too many of the good points, and this can lead to some problems. Okay, and so this, you can develop cases where this sort of stuff actually happens. Okay, so let's think about how would we prevent my estimator from being too bad of a fit, right? So what can we do about this? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about robust estimators. Okay, and let's start again by saying X are these real values. So again, we think about having some data which are the inliers, and then maybe there's like an outlier out here. These are my inliers. Okay, and so I want to come up with an estimator for the mean, not necessarily the maximum likelihood estimator on this data, which would again is the sample mean of the data, but some estimator which is going to be more robust to outliers. Okay. What maybe you learned maybe you learned this in high school. Maybe my kids are even learning this in like elementary school right now. What's a different way of getting an estimator that might be more robust to outliers?
Example, like say 10 points out of your 10 points, that mean, then compare to those. Then you would
Okay, so what you're describing is a cool method called ransack, which I'm not going to get into, where you do a bunch of subsamples of the data, you compute an estimator for each of them, and you find a consensus about this. So random sample consensus, something like that. It's and you take a bunch of these samples and you look at their estimators, and where a bunch of the samples agree, this turns out to be kind of a more robust estimator. The more complicated approach, I will tell you something that's in this vein that works really well. Ransack in general does not always work. Right? There's something simpler I have in mind. That's a good idea. Here. The median, great. This is what I was looking for. So the median, okay, so the median can be thought of as a variety of different ways. I can say sort data, take point at kind of like the 50th percentile, so halfway in the sorted order. This is one way of thinking about it. It's also the point which minimizes. So it's we'll call this mu bar tilde, which is the arg min of mu in real numbers that's minimizing the sum of xi and x of the distance between xi and mu. So it's minimizing the sum of the distances from all groups. These are the same, gives you the same point. These are both definitions of the median. The median, no matter how far away an outlier is still going to be somewhere in the middle of the distribution. Okay. So it has a property called the breakdown point, okay, which is the number of points needed to move, let's say, far inliers so that the estimator is outside the inliers. There's a technical way you can define this with some limits, that the fraction of points you need to move to infinity so that the estimator also goes to infinity. Okay, and you have to be a little bit careful in defining this, and I'm probably not going to get it quite right. So let me write this informal definition. Okay, but the mean has the property that if I send one outlier off to infinity, arbitrarily far away, the mean goes to infinity as well. Okay, the mean minimizes some of the squared errors. The median has a breakdown point. Okay, this has a breakdown point of 0.5. Okay, in 1D, meaning I would need to send half of the points to infinity or very far away to move the median outside from the set of inliers. That would mean half my points would have to be outliers. And at that point, when half of them are outliers, well, I probably, and especially if they're all grouped together someplace else, who's to say who's the outlier and who's actually the inlier, right? So it's got this really nice and strong property, right? So I can guarantee if I can compute the median instead of the mean, that my estimate is going to be kind of inside the data set. It's more secure. And that means if something has a very far residual from my estimator, the median, it really has to be pretty far from the data set if I trust it follows some nice like normal distribution model. Okay, so using a robust estimator like the median inside of this, and at least in the initial steps, is often a good idea if we can do that. Okay, next question. Okay, how to compute median in our D for D greater than 1. Okay, how do we define the median in 2 dimensions? The mean in multiple dimensions is straightforward. You do the coordinate-wise mean. Okay, and can we define, or in general, some robust estimator in higher dimensions? Or any robust estimator in so in RD. Yep.
Not just do what you said to do for like,
Yeah. Well, a good guess of this is called the geometric mean, which is going to be mu tilde equals arg min of mu now in RD. That is minimizing xi and x. Now the Euclidean distance xi minus mu. And so the sum, minimizing the sum of the distances instead of the sum of the square distances. Okay. Yeah, this is called the geometric mean. Is it? Okay, but this is not necessarily a robust estimate. Well, no, it's a robust estimator in the sense of the breakdown point. Okay, this has a kind of large breakdown point. But you have to be now careful with the definition. It means that this cannot go to infinity with a small fraction of points going to infinity. But it might not be close in a distributional sense. So if instead of having now if I'm in 2D, and now if I assume that the true mean is here, and instead of if instead of having a kind of the variance be equal in all directions, I have the variance being very far in this direction. There's a way to pick a small number of points up here as outliers where the geometric median or the geometric mean, okay, is going to be outside the convex hull of all the inliers. Okay, it's possible to pull it slightly away in some sense of these data points. There are some scenarios where it's not a good estimator, and so if I knew what the variance is, and these distributions may have very small actual overlap with each other. So if I have some issue where I don't quite have it scaled correctly, then this does not necessarily give me a good estimate. I could have some fraction, like 5% of the data points, pull this estimator far away from the actual kind of distribution of the data. At least in higher dimensions, it can be a problem. Okay, so this is a good guess, and for quite a while, until roughly about 5 years ago, I thought this was probably the right answer. But there are some scenarios where this actually does not very robust, especially as you get to higher dimensional problems. Okay, so it's also tricky to compute. It doesn't have a closed form solution anymore. I can't just take the average. I have to run some gradient descent, or even estimating the gradients is kind of, you have to do approximately. So this algorithm is kind of messy, but you can do it with get close with gradient descent. But it doesn't actually work that way. It works okay, but I'll tell you, eventually we'll get to something that will not too much harder than this and is easier than this to implement and will work even better in my experience. Yep.
Could we do a k-median clustering, like point that minimizes minimizes the max distance from the clustering point with that outliers?
So the k-center clustering, right? You're minimizing the maximum distance. The k-center is going to be the least is going to be the least outlier resistant, because it's going to try and, if I have to k-center right here and here, my one center is going to be here because it's equidistant from these two boundary points. Okay, so if I know there are only going to be one outlier, then I maybe pick two. If I know, then I can pick 1 point here and 1 point here, but there are two outliers. Well, then I just make sure those two outliers are far apart from each other. And again, it's a problem. Okay, so you can think of it's kind of the k-center, which is the max, is kind of like taking this to like a very large power. Like if I take it to the 10th power, I'm basically minimizing the maximum distance. The second power is the mean. The first power is the geometric mean, which is like the k-median clustering. That's the most resistant. If I make the power less than 1, it becomes not convex, and I can't solve it. So in this sense, in this model, taking it to the first power, which is what this is the best I can do in this family of things, where the k-center ends up being the worst. It's very susceptible to outliers. Okay, but it's a good thought to explore. Okay, there is a way that's quite old, I think from the 1950s or 60s, called the Tukey median. Okay, what this does is it considers a set of points. Okay, and so it tries to kind of, the Tukey median is a point, let's see, which has, it looks at the max of all half space. This will be a point, we'll call this P, half space that contains okay, it's a min of the max of all the half space H that contains P, the intersection of this with the data set, and I want to min over all P. Okay, so I want to find a point P star that if I look at any half space that contains, so this would be a half space H that contains P, it must contain a lot of other points. Okay, and I want to find the point P, so if I looked over all half spaces, including, say, this one here, this one maybe contains something like 40% of the points, right? 40% of the points. That one is the got these backwards here. It's a max min. So I want to find the half space that contains the least set of points that also contains P, and I want to maximize this over all points, right? So that every half space, even the worst case one, contains the smallest number of points. Okay, this is called the Tukey median. This one is robust to outliers. This one will give me a good estimator that will be in the middle of the distribution in some total variation sense. And it's hard to compute in go in high dimensions. So this gives a good estimator, but hard to compute for large D. The runtime is something like n to the D. Okay, and so this is kind of tight. So you basically it takes an exponential time like in the dimension to compute this or to approximately compute it. Okay, so if I want to, this isn't a good estimator, but it's very hard to compute as I get up to higher and higher dimensions, and it seems pretty complicated. So and this was the state of things until about 8 years ago. And then there were some kind of breakthroughs in this space. Okay, let me describe very briefly kind of the main idea behind how to solve this, and then I'll give you a simple algorithm that actually works quite well most of the time. Okay. So a robust mean estimator so what you do is you estimate the sample mean. Okay, then you estimate the sample covariance. And this assumes that the data is high dimensions and has identity covariance. If you want to also estimate the covariance, you have to do some extra work, but this is kind of the core idea here, sample covariance. This is going to be the 1 over n, or the size of x, of xi minus the sample mean, xi minus sample mean transpose, right? So this gives me a d by d covariance matrix. And so the observation is that if I have a distribution sampled this way, I kind of expect it to look normal. Not only, I can always estimate a mean, but I don't know if the mean is good. But if there are some outliers, what's going to happen is that if I look at the top principal component, right? I should be able to estimate what this is going to be. If it's from a normal distribution, it's not going to, or the top principal component, or the top and value, I kind of expect the value to be close to 1, right? It's from an identity covariance matrix, so I expect it to have roughly variance 1 in every direction. Okay, so if there are outliers and they are pulling the estimator in some direction, then that must correspond with the principal component of the full data set, including the outliers, right? So if it is problematic, then the top principal component will tell me it's problematic. It has to be. If there is a direction where it's pulled, well, that means the top principal component is telling me that direction is going to pull. So now, if the top principal component is the spectral norm of the covariance estimate, if this is too big, and because we assumed something about the normal distribution, we already estimated the mean, we assumed the covariance was identity, we can understand if it's too big. We can look at what we expect it to be, and if it's too big, then I filter points along the top eigenvector. Okay, so which is the top principal component here. So now I project all the points onto this one-dimensional subspace, that's going through here, right? So there's a one-dimensional subspace through here. I projected all the data points down onto here. And so from my estimator, these points are going to be very far, and I prune points off in either direction. And I can do this by looking at the cumulative density function of a normal distribution. And if my cumulative density function differs from that by too much, I know that there must be some outliers. So I'm going to end up pruning some from both sides. I prune some over here, and I prune some over here. I might prune some on the wrong side, but I could argue I won't prune too many over here that won't change the mean by too much. These will all be probably inliers. If they're inliers, I'm not going to prune too many of the inliers, and I'll still have enough left over to get a good estimate. And then I have to repeat this until I don't notice any outliers in my distribution. Okay. So this is the main algorithm. It's a little tricky to get these steps right. What is too big? How do I do the pruning? There are some formulas you can look up that you can, and in fact, you can't even write down the formulas. They don't have a closed form, but there are some lookup tables you can use. Okay, and so this method, and there was another method that came out in 2016. They basically showed that this was possible. You can do this efficiently as computing kind of the top eigenvector, which is not quite linear time, but you don't need the whole principal component. You just need the top one, and you can do this pretty efficiently. Okay, let me tell you a simpler algorithm. Okay, this is called that works quite well. And then we'll wrap up this part of it, the median of means. Okay, so this is a simpler algorithm that there's not a lot of magical things to kind of pick. There's one value I have to do. I have to choose a parameter k, and e.g. we found k equals 5 generally works pretty well. Should be an odd number, doesn't need to be too big. Okay, so this is 0. Step 1, I'm going to randomly split x into k equal sets, x1, x2, up to xk. Okay, so k is as small as 5 sets, so each of them still has a lot of points in them. Okay, 2, I'm going to create the calculate the mean of each xj. We'll call this mu j. Okay, and now do the coordinate wise median of the set mu1, mu2, up to mu k. Right, so this is why I want k to be an odd number, because then I just sort these 5 values and I take the middle. Okay, this is combining nice parts about the mean and the median. Okay, I'm taking the mean of each point, and then I take a coordinate-wise, I'm doing a coordinate-wise median at the end of this. Okay. So and this tends to work pretty well. It's actually surprisingly how well this method works. Each of the means can be off, but when I take the coordinate-wise median of these tend to do pretty well. So I found if you want a simple algorithm for this works pretty well as a robust estimator for the mean. So we did a large kind of experimental study of a bunch of these things last year. And there are other algorithms that perform a bit better, including variants of the one I told you on the previous slide. But this one worked surprisingly well, where things like the geometric mean did not do especially well. It tended to get easily fooled by it. some outliers in practice. If you had like 10% of the data was outliers. If you had like 1 or 2 outliers, it'd probably be fine. Okay, so I have 10 minutes left. I want to switch gears a little bit and tell you about a different paradigm. And so these are density-based outliers. Okay, and this is when you don't, when there is no parametric, so model kind of, or family of models. Okay, I don't have a parametric family of models. I say, here's the best fit model. Here's what I think the data looks like. I'm instead going off by, okay, I think that there's some dense points here, and then there's like an out. Okay, when there's no parametric model, okay, I still need a good distance function, right? So I still need a good distance function I can use to measure how similar some points are. Okay. So if I don't have a good distance measure of how similar some points are, there's not much I can do, right? If I have some extra information, I can do distance metric learning to try and learn a distance function. But I have to have, eventually I need at least some sort of distance function. Okay, so let me tell you, there are 2 kind of basic approaches which are strictly density-based outliers. I mean, we've kind of seen a version of this already with one option is I can run dB scan, right? Which was in this we talked about this in the hierarchical agglomerative clustering section. This is, often thought of a clustering algorithm, but all points not in cluster, these would be the outliers. Okay, so this is kind of a way of thinking about this. So, like some other ways of thinking about this is I can have a parameter k, which is going to be a number of points to define a neighborhood, and you need a similar parameter for dB scan, and I also need a threshold t or tau, and I say for each xi, look at the distance dk to the kth closest neighbor. Okay, so now I can use my fast k-nearest neighbor search algorithm that we talked about earlier in the semester. And if greater than tau, then it's an outlier. Okay, so I want to look at, so if I go back here, and for this data point, you can find the distance to the kth closest cluster, and if this is less than tau, all these points are in dense regions, whereas this point, the distance to the kth closest cluster, here, this is large, is greater than tau. Okay, so this is kind of you can identify this point here as, then this would be an outlier. Okay. There's another version of this where I can use a kernel density function. And so this is a bit or kernel density estimate. Okay, so what I can do is I can define a kernel between xi and some data point, some query point x, often as exp of negative this distance to xi q squared, right? So I can use a generic distance in here, and then a kernel density estimate of x of point q is going to be 1 over x, xi and x of, so it's kind of the average value of these kernels, xi q, right? So I'm averaging, so I'm kind of averaging this kind of, this is what this is doing, is it's putting kind of a bump around every one of the data points, and I average those bumps. And so for if some q, so if this is less than some threshold for some q, then q is an outlier. Okay, that means this is kind of a smoother way of doing this density estimate. Instead of using the distance to a k-nearest cluster, I'm kind of using a density estimate with kind of a fixed radius. Maybe I would define this by some bandwidth. Okay, there are more parameters we have to choose here, but this is kind of a smoother version. Okay. The problem with all of these approaches, okay, these all assume that the density is uniform, right, in the inliers, right? That there isn't what you often have in data sets, and some of you are explored some, where sometimes you have a very dense cluster, and then another case you have a well-defined, say, cluster of data, and then over here you have some more spread out data, but they're not really outliers. And then I may have a couple of stray points out here. These points are outliers, but for instance, these are not so outliers. Okay, so how do I determine a single density that covers this whole data set? There's not a single density. Okay, so the final thing I'll tell you about is called the reverse nearest neighbor. Okay, and so often I'll describe it for the nearest neighbor, but often you'd use a kth nearest neighbor distance instead. It's a little bit more robust for some parameter. Okay, maybe that's 5. Okay, and so for each xi in x, compute kind of di, which is the write this on the next line. Di, which is the arg min of xj in x, not xi, so other than itself, xi minus xj. Okay, so this is the distance to the nearest neighbor. You could think of replacing this with the distance to the kth nearest neighbor. Okay, so now okay, so let so n of qi equals xi in x is the nearest neighbor of qi, right? So this one's always the nearest neighbor, nearest to qi, okay? And if the ratio of d of qi over di of xi is too big, right? It's bigger than a threshold, then this is an outlier. Okay, so the idea is if the ratio, and now this is somewhat interpretable as well, if this ratio maybe is bigger than 5, the distance from, think of this as qi, this data point here, the distance to its nearest neighbor is going to be this far, but then this guy's nearest neighbor is kind of is much smaller here. So the ratio between this kind of this really large purple circle around QI versus this circle around its neighbor, if that is very different, then QI is probably an outlier. Okay, so this is robust at different densities at different points. If QI is near some other points, well, then it's probably not outlier. It's not all by itself. But again, these points, they're kind of spread out compared to the dense cluster over there, but they're roughly equal to each other as their nearest neighbors are also to each other. So the density, they're not different from the local density of these points, right? Where the outliers kind of would be. And to prevent having kind of two outliers just right next to each other, you might use the kth nearest neighbor instead of the first nearest neighbor. Okay, so this is a pretty, if you have a good notion of distance and you don't have a parametric model, this reverse nearest neighbor approach is a pretty nice approach to identify these outliers, which are not close to other data points like the data points are to each other. Yeah. So, okay, great. So we'll stop here. This is kind of a bunch of techniques for outlier detection.
With the